Okay guys, welcome back. In this lesson I will show you how to use Boto3 client and resource to list S3 buckets, and as usual we will test everything using moto library. So let's get started with the code. And first of all we need to create a new folder which will be called list buckets and will contain the source code for our lesson today. So within the folder we will create a list buckets client py file, and within this file we will write our code. What I would like to do to save us a little bit of time is to open our previous examples and just copy some lines from already existing code base. So basically we will contain the shebang string and doc string as well. So what I would like to do is to change the doc string to this script not creates but lists S3 buckets using Boto3 client. Okay, cool. And now we are ready to start developing our code base. So what we need to do first is to define a method which will be easier to test afterwards, which will be responsible for listing S3 buckets using client. And let's use password here for now. Okay, before we will jump into development, we need to go to Boto3 documentation, we need to go to client, and first of all take the client definition and save it here for now. Next we need to find a method which will list our buckets, and as you can see here it is. Let's click on it, and here's the request syntax. Again we are copying the request syntax, paste here. And now let's take a look how the response data structure will look like. So basically we will be returned with a Python dictionary which will contain a list of buckets by the key buckets, and this information we will not need at all. Okay, cool. So as soon as we know how the data structure will look like, let's go back to the code, take our lines and put them here. So let's rename the client to the S3 client to make the name more meaningful. Replace the client here and call list buckets. Cool. So now we have a response object which will contain our data structure. And now let's return a list which will contain bucket names. So to do that, we need to use a for loop, and within this for loop we will walk through response object and buckets key, right? So what we are doing here, basically for every single item in the response object from here, we will take this data structure, save it to bucket variable, and now all we need to do is to use bucket name key to save an item to our list which will return from the method. Okay, cool. Now let's create the main function. If name equals main, and within this main method let's get our buckets list from this method and use the for loop to print a list of buckets one by one. For bucket and buckets print something like bucket. Okay, so it looks like our code is ready here, right? Now let's go ahead and create the unit test for this code before we will actually execute it in a real environment and make sure that it does not contain any errors. First things first, let's create a test file. New file. Let's call test underscore list buckets client UI. And let's go to, again, already existing test case from our previous lesson. Copy the content and paste it in our file, and we will adjust the whole thing here. Okay, cool. What I would like to do, I would like to take the doc string from our initial file and paste it here. So what I would like to do next is to slightly adjust it. This script tests list the string buckets method Boto3 client and using moto library. Okay, now we will keep the imports. Now we need to rename the class to make the name a little bit more meaningful. So let's call test list S3 buckets. Again, our test case our test case class will inherit unit test case. Class setup method will stay the same. We will keep the decorator again just to ask Boto to connect to in-memory API rather than real API over the network. Now we need to import our method, this one, from our file. Let's copy the file name, paste it here. As soon as we imported it, let's remove this content and think about what we would like to test. So first of all, I would like to make sure that during the first test, there should be no buckets at all. Empty bucket list. Next, I would like to create a couple of buckets and test that all buckets, all created buckets, are returned by our method. So I think that will be more than enough to test our code. So let's do it. Let's create a buckets variable. Let's get a list of buckets from here, and let's use self assert equals assert equal method. And now let's compare the buckets variable with an empty list. So basically we are assuming that the buckets will contain an empty list here. Next, we already know how to create buckets from the previous lesson. Let's create a couple of buckets, something like self S3 client, then create bucket method, and here we will use, just for simplicity, only bucket argument, which will contain a name of the bucket, like bucket 1, and here bucket 2. And afterwards, let's repeat the same steps get list of buckets from our list buckets method, and now this buckets list should contain the bucket 1 and bucket 2 as a list. Okay, so everything else should stay the same, and it looks like we are ready to test our method right now. Let's execute our test. Let's type Python S3 lessons list buckets and test list bucket client. And here we go. Our method runs without any issues. Now let's go ahead and execute our method in the real environment. Let's repeat our command, but instead of calling test file, we'll call list buckets client, and it should return the list of all the S3 buckets from my account. Cool. That's exactly how we are listing S3 buckets and testing the code base. For Boto3 client. Now, let's do the same thing for Boto3 resource. Again, let's close both of these files. Let's duplicate the list buckets client file. Let's rename it. Let's put the word resource here and open here. Okay, cool. So let's change the clients to the resources everywhere. Resource in the method name. Then instead of the client, S3 client, we will use S3 resource. We will change the definition here. Okay, so as you remember, S3 resource does not contain the list buckets method. Instead, as I remember, we should rely, again, let's go to service resource in the documentation. The definition, we already changed the definition, but we are relying on the buckets collection and the all method, right? So let's go ahead and do it. Let's remove this buckets from here. List buckets and use buckets collection and all method. And it will return us an iterator to the list of all buckets, right? So now let's call it bucket iterator. And now we will use this buckets iterator in our for loop for every single bucket from the bucket iterator. We need to get a bucket name. So the bucket will be a class, an instance of the class bucket, and to get access to the bucket name, we should get an access to the name attribute. Okay, so now let's copy the method name here, paste it here, and everything else should stay the same. Cool. Now what I would like to do is to test our list buckets using the resource method in the similar way like we did with the client. Let's go ahead and do it. So let's duplicate the file, rename it, replace the client to the resource, and open it. Okay, this script test lists S3 buckets method, Boto3 resource, using moto library. Everything is the same. The test class name may stay the same. Instead of S3 client, we will use S3 resource. Okay. Now test create S3 bucket using not a client but resource. And now we need to import our method from this file, and let's take the file name and paste it here. So now the error disappeared. Now we are ready to repeat the same test, right? So we are taking our method. It will return us an empty list of buckets. So this test should pass. Now we can rely on S3 resource, which has create bucket method. And let's go ahead and find it. Let's go to service resource, and we will rely on this create bucket method. This create bucket method accepts pretty much the same parameters as the client's create bucket method, right? And we will use just only bucket name as a string. That's why we don't have any errors here. So those two API calls will use Boto3 S3 resource, create bucket method, and create a couple of buckets for us. Now let's take the method definition, name, and there we go. Those are all the changes which we need to introduce in our test case, and it should work. Let's go ahead and check it out. So let's call Python, and then S3 lessons, and then list buckets, and then we will call test list buckets resource py file, and our test should execute without any errors. No, we have an error over here. Let's figure out what's going on. S3 object has no attribute buckets, and the error is coming from S3 lesson, list buckets, test bucket, line 21. Let's take a look what's going on. On line 21, buckets, list buckets using the resource. Sorry, what? Okay, it means that probably we have an error somewhere here. So what we need to do, let's go ahead and check it out. So first of all, we are using S3 resource. Of course, yes. We forgot to replace the client to the resource. Now let's go ahead and repeat our test case. And now, as you can see, the bug which we introduced in our software development cycle has been successfully identified and fixed even before we ran our code in the real environment. Now let's go ahead and execute our Python script in real account, S3 lessons, list buckets, and list buckets resource file, and it should return us the same list of all the buckets from my AWS account. Thank you for your attention. That's exactly how we are that's exactly how we are listing S3 buckets and unit testing our code. So in the next lesson, we will see how to filter S3 buckets using clients and resources. Stay tuned. See you in the next lesson.